Profile 9, opening the door to events and issues affecting the people of Siouxland.
And good morning, everyone. I'm Brian Allen. Welcome to another edition of Profile 9. Thanks for joining us. When you talk about interesting people, I think that my guest this morning certainly fits into that category. Maybe no stranger to you. This is Ralph Swain from Briarcliff College. He teaches broadcasting as well as journalism, don't you? Just mass communications up there in general?
Yeah, mostly broadcasting.
And the reason that we have Ralph on this morning is, speaking of interesting stories, this is a guy that went to Vietnam, served as a soldier in Vietnam, but that is where he also, I guess, cut your teeth in journalism. Tell us about that.
Well, I got interested in writing when I was over there. I just started writing for some what we called underground newspapers because the mainline press had their own correspondents and they tended to favor them. So I started writing for some smaller papers and had articles published back in the United States.
Now,
I got interested.
Where does the itch come from? I mean, you go over there as a soldier. You're in this war that at that time was dividing the country.
Yeah.
Should we be there? Should we not be there? Obviously, there was a lot of conflict to write about here at home. What was the genesis of your writing in the beginning over in Vietnam?
I had just received my college degree, my 4-year degree in political science. So I had some interest in world politics. And when I ended up in Vietnam, I was trained as a combat medic at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, but then ended up in Vietnam in logistics in the Area Command Headquarters in USRV, which is the U.S. Army Republic of Vietnam, which handled the entire logistical support for the war in 3 Corps, which was the Saigon area of Vietnam.
Before we went on the air, we were discussing your background. You got your draft notice 30 days before you were to receive your degree. How does that feel, to get a notice like that so close to accomplishing, you know, something big in your life?
Well, when there's a war going on and there are casualties, people coming back in body bags, and it's 10,000 miles away, and you see it on the news, but it's not really real until you get that letter that starts with the words greetings, and it's from Uncle Sam. And of course they had the draft at that time, and selective service plus the draft. So they knew if you had a college deferment, they pretty much knew when you were getting out of school, when you were getting out.
What are we seeing right now?
We're rolling some of the slides I took over in Vietnam. These are the Delta shots from a helicopter. It's a very beautiful country there. This is the Saigon River, and it's a very large river that works its way up to Saigon, and this is the port of Saigon where tens of millions of dollars worth of supplies came in on a daily basis. This is a tributary, form of transportation on one of the tributaries, Saigon. Another tributary of the Saigon River, a lot of shanties built over the river on sticks because of the refugees that came into the city. I always like this sign. This kind of says it all. Chase Manhattan Bank, you have a friend in Saigon. You know, money is made on war, just like just any other adventure.
Looking back on it now, what do you primarily remember most as you arrived in Vietnam? What's the first thing that sticks in your mind? What's the first thing that really struck you?
That's very easy to remember, and I think a majority of American soldiers would have the same feeling. I flew in a C-130 cargo plane, and there's no seats in it, so you sit in the back bay, and the back bay drops open, and that heat hits you, and the humidity hits you, and the smell of diesel fuel and incense, it's something that really sticks in your mind. And every now and then when I smell diesel fuel, I get these kind of memory flashes of that period of time. So.
When you go through something like that and you remember that, that really brings the war back to you. You actually...
Yeah, I don't jump under cars when I hear backfire or something like that. A significant number of veterans that came back from Vietnam, of course, suffered from PTSD. And then you can suffer from PTSD at different levels too, very severe to mild. And others were able to deal with it and adjust to civilian life without any problems.
So you go over to Vietnam to serve as a soldier in the war, and then you decide that the itch hits you to start writing about your experiences, what you see around you, what your experiences are. What's the first thing you write about, and why?
Well, because I was interested in political science and particularly interested in Asian history, I was in a position in a headquarters, area command headquarters facility where I had access to a lot of inside information, as the rest of us did. In fact, we had 15 American soldiers in headquarters. Every one of us was a college graduate, and it was specifically designed that way. And every one of us knew how to type, which doesn't seem unusual today with computers, but back then it wasn't that easy to find males that could type. It was always the women that went on to secretarial school and so forth. So they selected us, and I ended up in this big pool of headquarters clerks. And we handled everything from court-martials to the military police, supplies, the PXs, the post exchanges, the big stores, military stores, weapons, captured war trophies. I mean, just about any disposition short of the actual combat we were in charge of. And the paperwork was phenomenal, what we had to do. We handled all the 201 files, the personnel files of every soldier that arrived in Vietnam and stayed in Vietnam. So we had access to that. But the thing that got me interested in writing was that a lot of the information that we got our hands on through investigative work and so forth was information that the press didn't have that I thought the American public should be aware of. And it was pretty frightening. And it was information that wasn't dealing with, okay, in the past 24 hours, 35 communists were killed, and then American troops suffered 3 casualties, you know, the baseball scores that you heard in the news. This was black market activities, this was drugs, this was corruption among our NCOs that were operating service clubs and actually liquor lounges, Army, military-run liquor lounges with floor shows and entertainment. The amount of illegal contraband that went out the back door of service clubs into the hands of the corrupt South Vietnamese police, soldiers, government officials was phenomenal. And they, of course, tried to keep a lid on that as long as they could. And eventually a lot of that made the press, but I felt that there was a need to get that out sooner so the American public realized that it's not just a war. There's another side to the war, and it's our money. It's taxpayers' money. We spent $200 billion, and that's 1960, 1970 dollars on that war, and that's a conservative estimate by the Defense Department. So you might want to add a few billion more to that.
Right. Let me ask you this. You were not an accredited correspondent, right?
No.
You were over there as a soldier.
Right.
You had access to sensitive information.
Sure. Sure. We had some eyes-only stuff.
The question that I'm sure is now becoming clear to viewers is, how are you able to get away with this? How are you able to be a correspondent? How are you able to write this?
Probably because I was a little bit cocky. I had a good service record. I was on advanced acceleration. I was a Spec 5 before I got to Vietnam, which is 5 ranks above the entry level. So in the 2 years before I went to Vietnam, I was up Spec 5. And I had my own personal feelings about what was going on. Back in 1970, and the war didn't end until 75, but back in 1970, me and a lot of the other people in headquarters knew we weren't going to win. And President Nixon was still talking that we would win, and then he came up with Peace with Honor, which was really a way to withdraw and save face. Much as the Asians need to save face, we had to too. So for 2 years, he withdrew in increments American soldiers. I can tell you a really neat story about that too. The American press had told the American people that the First Army United States First Army, which was called Big Red 1, was coming home. That was the first unit to deploy out of Vietnam. And so, according to the American press and the American people, they assumed that this particular units or battalions of the First Army would be coming home. Well, I was called out on a special guard duty detail at Tonsonet Air Base, along with a bunch of other GIs, to set up perimeter guard during these big ceremonies, because even in downtown Saigon in late 69, you could be under attack by guerrillas and so forth, sappers and so forth. And I discovered how they did this. They weren't complete battalions that had fought in the field and came home. What they did is they went to the computer and they looked up the shortest dates, the short dates of people from all different units. And they sent them orders and they said, you are to report to Saigon in 24 hours, and here are your orders. And when they got to Saigon, they took off their patches of their various units and sewed on the Big Red 1. So by the time all these GIs assembled on the tarmac at Tonsonet Air Base with the cameras and the bands and the big ceremony, these guys didn't know the guy standing next to them because they were with a different unit who were ordered, you're going home. But all of a sudden they became First Army members.
And so
it was a PR hype.
So they were passed off then as the Big Red 1.
Yep. Yep. And I wondered how the parents felt, because parents, knowing their son was in a particular battalion of the Big Red 1, assumed their son was coming home, and found out, I don't know how much later, that they weren't.
He doesn't.
This is the way it was done.
We are discussing Vietnam this morning with Ralph Swain from Briarcliff College. He was there. A lot of interesting stories. Stay tuned to Profile 9. And welcome back to Profile 9. Our guest this morning is Ralph Swain from Briarcliff College. We're talking this morning, though, about Vietnam. Ralph was there as a soldier, and also that's where he began to cut his teeth, I guess you could say, as a war correspondent. Before we went to break, Ralph said that back in 1970, you knew that there was no way that America would win Vietnam. What were you seeing? How did you know? What gave you that opinion?
Well, a lot of it had to do with the numbers that just didn't stack up. And in headquarters, we had access to casualty figures and so forth. And we had found out, as many years later, the national media found out, and it's been in the news, that the high command in Vietnam had been inflating the enemy dead and to a certain extent deflating our casualties, and particularly ARVN, the South Vietnamese Army casualties. And there was a joke around headquarters when I was working there that if we added up all the total figures that the Pentagon was giving out for casualties of the enemy, the dead enemy, that we would have wiped out North Vietnam twice over. So, I mean, if they're playing those kind of figures, you know that there's something that they don't want to tell the public, and they're trying to keep the public's backing for the effort.
Sure, public support.
And that's one example. I saw, you know, you see on a daily basis over there treatment, the relationship between the Vietnamese populace and the Americans. I mean, we should have been there winning their hearts and minds. And I think initially we were. And I can remember early in the war, in the early 60s, the Green Berets were among the first units to set up clinics and hospitals and rebuild churches and pagodas and hand out medical supplies. But as the war dragged on and became more ferocious, those type of civic action programs started to disappear. And when I was there, just about the only civic action activity was by the Filipino troops who served in Vietnam. And PhilCAG, Civic Action Group of the Filipino military, were 100% involved in reconstruction of schools, churches, doing medical clinic assistance to villages and that type of thing. And the Americans, eventually, we became too preoccupied with the tactical side of the war, you know, just trying to hang on and destroy the enemy, and it wasn't working.
This is a question that has been debated ever since the war began, and obviously since the war ended, and I've never had a chance to ask it in an interview situation until right now. Is this a war that America should have been involved in to begin with? It seems on the surface that it was a civil conflict between North and South Vietnam. Should we have been there?
You know, it's easy to be Monday morning quarterback and having been there and studied the history to say, no, we shouldn't have. But I also am not, I'm also aware of the mentality of the American government and our State Department at the time. We had just come out of, China had fallen in 1949 to communism. A year later, we got involved in the Korean War with North Korea versus South Korea, and we partitioned that off, and we were in the Cold War with the Russians, and communism was this big bugaboo, you know, this evil dominating influence, and that's true to a great extent. But the domino theory, which was promoted back then by the State Department, just didn't hold true. That if Vietnam fell to communism, then Cambodia and Laos and Thailand and Burma and the whole Southeast Asia, and it didn't happen. So that, you know, that's an example of where I could see the mentality of the government and the State Department really believing that communism, we had to fight communism in Vietnam 10,000 miles away. My personal feeling, even before I got there, was I didn't think I would see North Vietnamese sampans off the coast of San Francisco if we didn't stop them in Vietnam. But believe me, there were people that believed that. They were not interested in taking over Southeast Asia. They were interested in reuniting North and South.
Tell us about this. Being an enlisted soldier over there in the war, how would you get away to file reports, to actually interview people, to go out and to dig up the information? Where would you find the time, and how did you do it?
Okay, when you are in a rear area, and keep in mind that support troops outnumbered combat about 5 to 1. And I think, again, a lot of the American public doesn't realize how logistically difficult it is to keep an American soldier in fighting shape in a war. And when you consider that for every approximately 4 or 5, in some cases 6 American soldiers had to support one soldier, you have this tremendous machinery in Saigon, Da Nang, and Quy Nhon, and Cam Ranh Bay. And these are people who almost have 9-to-5 jobs. They're in uniform, they have to carry weapons, they're trained to fight, and they can be called up any time, and we were during emergencies. But they're basically 9-to-5ers that run the depots and the supply, security. There was a whole complex of military police in Saigon that all they were, particular units were worried about was just the drug problem, which was unbelievable over there. And black market activities, crimes, crimes of a GI would get drunk in a bar, and there'd be a Western shootout with real guns, you know, 45s with a South Vietnamese officer who maybe got jealous because he was making moves on a Vietnamese woman. I can remember covering one of those and seeing the blood up the stairs as we went to the place with the police. Saigon was an unbelievable place. It was the most densely populated in the world at the time. It had corruption and crime totally rampant, and you know, that was quite an experience. That's why a lot of GIs called Vietnam Never Never Land, you know. It was, you could have been on the moon as well as 10,000 miles on the other side of the earth. It was so different than what we were used to.
Tell me about the black market over in Vietnam.
The black market took many different forms. It had to do with military, or excuse me, the monetary exchange rate. It was illegal for an American soldier to possess an American greenback, which is what we use as exchange, $10, $20. It was illegal, and it was a court-martial offense if you were caught with American money on your possession. What the military does when it goes overseas is that it issues script, which is, in Vietnam, it was called MPC, Military Payment Certificate. In fact, you were paid in this play money. So every 30 days when he went to the pay officer to get your great $360 a month is what I got. That included combat pay. They paid you in MPCs. And the MPCs would change over every 6 months. So if you didn't take those in and change them for the new MPCs, you might as well light your cigarettes with them. They were useless paper. Well, the MPCs were still worth an American dollar. And the official exchange rate of Vietnamese piastres to an American dollar fluctuated, when I was there, usually around 360 Vietnamese dollars to an American dollar. But you could take the American dollar or the American MPC and go to just about any business in the community and change it for 3 or 4 times the rate. Okay, so where there's this huge monetary black market where a GI could exchange money and get 3 to 4 times what if they went to a bank or a post office to exchange it. Well, the Vietnamese, of course, got involved in that too, and that was a very depressed economy, so black market thrived over there. You had black market in weapons. You could walk down the street and see American hand grenades, M16 rifles sold on the street. And this frightening thing about that is that if they were being sold on the black market on the street, then a Viet Cong, a Vietnamese communist guerrilla, could just as easily buy it off the street, and they were. And every once in a while, the South Vietnamese government would have this big show where they'd raid these different streets in Saigon, and they'd confiscate all the weapons, the illegal weapons and black market stuff, and they'd burn the contraband in the middle of the street, and all the press was there, and then you wouldn't hear anything for 6 months. So the very next day, the same goods were right back on the street, the same hand grenades and M16 rifles and so forth.
Just a recurring problem.
Oh, yeah. They never did straighten that out.
We are talking to Ralph Swain this morning, talking about Vietnam. A lot of interesting stories this man has, and we'll hear more of them after this. And welcome back to Profile 9. Ralph Swain is my guest on this Sunday morning, talking about his experiences as a soldier and both as a correspondent in Vietnam. You told me once that you used to go out under the cover of darkness and talk to people and find out information. There has to be fear. Was there fear? Were you scared?
The first time I did it, there was. What I did is, see, it was illegal to be out of uniform in Vietnam. You could get court-martialed and put in the stockade. But I found that as long as I wore the American uniform, there was a distance between me and the Vietnamese people, and it was hard to communicate with them. They were very suspicious. And so I went down to a tailor in downtown Saigon and had this correspondence outfit made up, and, you know, with the pockets in it, and, this tropical worsted material. And I had 2 of those outfits made up, and I decided what I'd do is, in the evening, I'd get get out of my uniform, put this on, and go into Saigon, and I did, and I was amazed at how the relationship, because I wasn't in uniform, changed radically, and I would be able to communicate with the people, and I learned a lot more that way by going into places and not carrying a weapon and not wearing a uniform. But the first time I did, I was really nervous because if the MPs had caught me, I would have been arrested and probably court-martialed.
Give us a feel, if you would. What is Saigon like at night in these areas in the early 70s while a war is going on?
It's like a movie. It was like a movie. The streets are teeming, mostly with 90cc Hondas and Suzukis, a lot of foot traffic, and the rest is military traffic. Neon signs, all kinds of strange smells, being assaulted all the time by people, children up to adults, asking for this or that or trying to sell you something. Some great restaurants in Saigon, a lot of good and a lot of bad. And I was 10,000 miles away, and I told myself I may not have an opportunity again to do this, so enjoy it, do it, take a chance, you know. Boy, I mean, it was quite an experience, and I had lived in Central America as a child for 3 years, and I liked the tropics, and I was very much interested in other cultures, so I took a chance, you know, and
it's one of those once-in-a-lifetime things.
Sure.
When you're talking to these people, what are you asking them? What are they telling you?
Asking them about the war, asking about their feelings, about Americans, about the VC, things like that. Things that they probably wouldn't say to someone that was in uniform.
And what are they telling you?
Well, you get I found out that a lot of the citizens of Saigon were not friendly to Americans because of what was happening. They really didn't understand why we were there, and they saw the corruption and the death and destruction that the war machine caused, and it was hard to convince them.
Final question I've got for you. We've got about a minute left in the show. When did you leave Vietnam, and what kind of feeling did you take with you?
I'll never forget the day I left Vietnam. The Jeep came to pick me up, and there was this little girl about 10 years old who was among the refugee kids we used to give candy to and buy hamburgers for and so forth. And I remember she waved goodbye, and then the Jeep went around the block, and she ran through the alley and appeared at the other side of the block, and she was waving. That was hard. I mean, I felt like stuffing her in a duffel bag and sneaking her out of there. But
thanks for joining us this morning, Ralph. Ralph Swain's been our guest, talking about Vietnam, his experiences as both a soldier and a correspondent. That's all we have for this week. We'll see you next Sunday morning on Profile 9.